The light finds Lauren Hutton at 80, still unretouched, still unstoppable. The gap between her teeth has widened into legend. Her face is geography now, mapped by laughter, sun, and defiance. When asked if she wants editing, she laughs. I never closed the gap, because it's where the light comes in. The world once told her to fix it. She taught the world to widen it. But rewind to 1968, when that same gap was the reason 30 modeling agencies slammed doors in her face. Fix your teeth, they said. You're too strong, they said. You'll never work in this industry, they said. Lauren, 24 years old with $200 to her name and nothing left to lose, smiled at each rejection and thought, watch me. She didn't know she was about to rewrite the definition of American beauty. Didn't know her imperfection would become more iconic than 1,000 perfect faces. She just knew she refused to change herself to fit someone else's narrow idea of acceptable. The gap stayed, the world bent. This is the story of a woman who turned rejection into revolution, who made authenticity fashionable before anyone knew they needed it, who proved that beauty's most radical act is refusing to apologize for being real. Lauren Hutton didn't just become a supermodel. She became proof that the things we're told to hide are often the things that make us unforgettable. Imperfection wasn't beauty's disguise. It was beauty's announcement. Charleston, South Carolina, November 17, 1943. Mary Lawrence Hutton was born into a world that would tell her in countless ways that she wasn't enough. Her family was working class, struggling, the kind of poverty that's respectable but exhausting. Her father died when she was young, leaving her mother to raise 3 children alone on a secretary's salary. There was no safety net, no cushion, no room for dreams that didn't have immediate practical application. Lauren grew up understanding scarcity not as temporary condition but as permanent state. There wasn't money for new clothes, for dance lessons, for the things that might polish a young girl into society's idea of feminine achievement. But there was space, the wide open South with its swamps and forests and coastlines, and Lauren claimed that space as her own. She climbed trees, caught snakes, rode bikes too fast down hills, collected scrapes and bruises like badges. She was, by all accounts, a tomboy in an era when that term was used pejoratively, meant to shame girls back into acceptable femininity. But Lauren couldn't be shamed into stillness. The wildness in her was essential, not decorative. It wasn't something she performed or affected. It was simply who she was beneath the scripts society tried to hand her. She was curious, fearless, allergic to the kind of careful behavior expected of Southern girls who wanted to be marriageable. She asked too many questions. She laughed too loud. She took up space in ways that made adults uncomfortable. School was torture, not because she wasn't intelligent, but because the rigid structure felt suffocating. Sit still, be quiet, color inside the lines, wait your turn. Every rule felt arbitrary, designed to break spirits rather than build minds. Lauren complied enough to get by, but her real education happened outside classrooms in the natural world where there were no teachers to tell her she was doing it wrong. The gap in her teeth appeared early, a genetic quirk that became more pronounced as she grew. In another family with more resources, it might have been corrected with orthodontia. But for the Huttons, dental work was a luxury reserved for emergencies, not cosmetic concerns. Lauren grew up with her gap, unconscious of it as a flaw because there was no money to fix it and therefore no point dwelling on it. It's impossible to know what would have become of Lauren Hutton if that gap had been closed in childhood. Would she have been just another pretty face, interchangeable with 1,000 others? Did the gap, and the poverty that prevented its correction, inadvertently preserve the thing that would make her unique? These are unanswerable questions, but they're worth asking because they point to the randomness at the heart of all success stories. The way limitation can paradoxically become liberation. As a teenager, Lauren was restless, ambitious in a way she couldn't yet articulate. She knew she wanted out of Charleston, out of poverty, out of the narrow life that seemed predetermined for working-class Southern girls. But out to what? She had no clear vision, no specific dream, just a bone-deep certainty that staying would mean dying in some essential way. She took odd jobs, waitressing, secretarial work, anything that paid. She saved money obsessively, every dollar a vote for escape. She was 19 when she finally left, heading to New York with $200 and absolutely no plan beyond arrival. It was 1963, and New York was the center of everything: art, culture, fashion, possibility. Lauren had no connections, no insider knowledge, no real understanding of how the city worked. She just knew it was where things happened, and she wanted to be where things happened. The early New York years were hard in ways that make good stories later but feel like drowning while you're living them. Lauren worked minimum wage jobs, lived in apartments so small and shabby they barely qualified as shelter. She waitressed at Playboy Club, served coffee in offices, typed letters for executives who barely acknowledged her existence. She was beautiful in a way that made people look twice, but beauty without connections or money is just another thing to carry. Occasionally useful, but not transformative. The city was brutal and indifferent, chewing up and spitting out dreamers by the thousands. Lauren watched other girls arrive with the same hopes, the same desperation, and leave months later defeated, broke, heading back to wherever they'd escaped from with nothing to show for their attempt but debt and disillusionment. She understood she could easily become one of those statistics. Another pretty girl who thought beauty would be enough and learned the hard way that it wasn't. But Lauren had something those other girls didn't. Not more talent or better connections, but a fundamental stubbornness, a refusal to quit that bordered on the irrational. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to turn back now. Every rejection made her more determined, not less. Every closed door just meant she'd knock on another one. She developed a philosophy during those lean years. The worst they can say is no, and she'd already heard that word so many times it had lost its sting. There were moments of doubt, nights when she sat in her terrible apartment eating cheap food and wondering what the hell she was doing, why she was putting herself through this, whether going home and finding a normal job might be the smarter choice. But then morning would come, and with it a renewed determination. She didn't know how to quit, didn't have the mechanism for surrender built into her. Forward was the only direction she understood. She stumbled into modeling almost by accident, or rather modeling stumbled into her. Someone suggested she try it, gave her a few names. Lauren, who had never considered herself model material, thought, why not? She had nothing to lose except time, and time was the one thing she had in abundance. The rejections came fast and brutal. Agency after agency took one look at her and said no. The Gap was the official reason. Fix your teeth and come back. But Lauren sensed there was more to it. She was too tall, too athletic, too much. She didn't have the delicate, unthreatening prettiness that defined mid-1960s fashion. She looked like she could change a tire or punch someone if necessary. She looked capable, and capability wasn't what fashion wanted to sell. 30 rejections. 30 different versions of, you're not right for this. 30 invitations to change herself, to sand down her edges, to become more palatable. Each one stung, but each one also hardened something in Lauren. A resolve to make it on her terms or not at all. She wasn't going to fix her teeth. She wasn't going to shrink or soften or apologize. If the industry couldn't see past her gap to her potential, that was their failure of imagination, not hers. 30 agencies said no. History said thank you. And then finally someone looked deeper. Diana Vreeland, legendary editor of Vogue, saw in Lauren what others had missed, not despite her imperfections, but because of them. Vreeland understood that fashion was about to shift, that the perfect, untouchable beauty of the earlier decade was giving way to something more real, more attainable, more American. She famously said of Lauren, "She is America, sunshine and danger in the same face." In 1968, Lauren Hutton appeared on the cover of Vogue. The photograph is now iconic, Lauren's face filling the frame, her smile wide and genuine, the gap between her teeth front and center. She wasn't posing, she was being. There was no coyness, no attempt to seduce through vulnerability. She looked directly at the camera with the confidence of someone who had nothing to prove because she had already survived the worst rejection could offer. The gap stayed. The world bent. Sometimes the smallest refusal shifts the entire mirror. The response was immediate and divided. Traditional fashion editors were horrified. This was their premier publication, and they'd put a woman with a gap-toothed smile on the cover? Letters arrived from established industry figures expressing concern, disappointment, confusion. Had standards fallen so low? Was this really what Vogue was selling now? Imperfection as aspiration? But readers responded differently. The letters that poured in from ordinary women told a different story. They wrote about seeing themselves in Lauren, about having been told their own imperfections disqualified them from beauty. Women with gaps in their teeth, women with strong features, women who had always felt too much or too different, they saw Lauren and felt permission to exist as they were. The cover wasn't just a photograph, it was a mirror that reflected a broader definition of beauty than fashion had previously allowed. One letter, which Vogue published months later, captured the sentiment. "I've spent 20 years hating my smile because of the gap in my teeth. Then I saw Lauren Hutton on your cover, and for the first time in my life I smiled without covering my mouth. Thank you for showing me that I don't need to be fixed." Lauren read that letter and hundreds like it, and understood that what was happening went beyond her personal success. She had inadvertently become a symbol of something larger. Permission for women to be imperfect, visible proof that you didn't have to erase your quirks to be acceptable. It was a responsibility she hadn't asked for, but she accepted it with the same straightforward practicality she approached everything else. Lauren's career exploded. Within a year, she was one of the most sought-after models in the world, working with legendary photographers like Richard Avedon, Helmut Newton, and Irving Penn. But she was different from other models in ways that went beyond her appearance. She brought intelligence and curiosity to shoots, asked questions, offered ideas, treated modeling as collaboration rather than passive participation. Avedon, who photographed her dozens of times, said, "Lauren doesn't perform for the camera, she converses with it." Newton, known for his highly stylized, often controversial work, found in Lauren a subject who could embody both strength and sensuality without making them contradictory. "She was never just a body or just a face," he said. "She was a presence, a person. That's rare in this business." Behind the scenes, Lauren was developing a reputation as someone who didn't play by industry rules. She showed up to shoots in jeans and no makeup, would change in the back of cabs, treated $5,000 gowns with the same casual respect she'd give a t-shirt. She wasn't trying to be difficult. She simply couldn't muster the reverence that fashion expected. Clothes were clothes, work was work. None of it was life or death, and she refused to pretend otherwise. This attitude should have gotten her blacklisted, should have marked her as difficult and ungrateful. The fashion industry in the late 1960s and early 1970s had rigid hierarchies and expectations. Models were supposed to be grateful, compliant, decorative, but not opinionated. Lauren broke every rule in the unwritten handbook. She questioned photographers' choices, suggested her own ideas, showed up late without apology, treated famous designers like regular people rather than gods. But something about Lauren made the industry accommodate her instead of reject her. Maybe it was her talent, the way she could transform a shoot with a single look, the way cameras loved her no matter what she wore or how she moved. Maybe it was her commercial success. The covers sold, the campaigns worked, clients kept requesting her. Or maybe it was something less tangible. The understanding that Lauren's lack of pretension was refreshing in a world drowning in artifice. That her authenticity was the thing that made her valuable. Years later, Irving Penn would say in an interview, "Lauren was the first model I worked with who seemed completely unbothered by the camera. Most models are either intimidated by it or performing for it. Lauren just existed in front of it as if the camera was irrelevant to who she was. That's incredibly rare." Helmut Newton, whose highly stylized and often controversial photographs defined an era of fashion, found in Lauren something he couldn't quite articulate but recognized as essential. "She had wildness in her," he said. "Not the performed wildness that models fake. Real wildness, like something untamed that just happened to wander into a studio. You couldn't direct Lauren, really. You could suggest, but she was always herself." In 1973, everything changed again. Revlon, one of the biggest cosmetics companies in the world, offered Lauren an exclusive contract worth $1 million. At the time, the highest-paid modeling contract ever given to a woman. The number itself was significant, but the symbolism was more important. Lauren Hutton, the girl who'd been rejected for having a gap in her teeth, was now worth more than any model before her. She turned a cosmetic contract into a manifesto. At the press conference announcing the deal, a reporter asked, "Do you think you're worth $1 million?" Lauren smiled, that gap catching the light, and said, "Every woman who was told she's not enough just got a raise." The quote became a rallying cry, proof that the standards gatekeepers enforced were arbitrary and changeable. That value wasn't inherent in perfection, but in authenticity and confidence. Women who had spent years trying to fix their own gaps, literal or metaphorical, suddenly saw those gaps differently. Not as flaws to hide, but as features to claim. The Revlon years were glamorous and lucrative, but also constraining in ways Lauren hadn't anticipated. She was now the face of a major brand, which meant her image had to be controlled, her behavior monitored, her personal life managed to protect Revlon's investment. There were clauses in her contract about weight, about not doing nude photography, about maintaining a certain standard of respectability. She cashed the check but kept the attitude. Lauren chafed against these restrictions even as she fulfilled her contractual obligations. She did the shoots, attended the events, smiled for the cameras. But in her private life, she lived with a freedom that bordered on reckless. She learned to ride motorcycles, bought a Harley-Davidson, and rode it cross-country. She took up scuba diving, got certified, and started traveling to remote locations to dive: Belize, Indonesia, the Maldives. She went on safari in Africa, trekked through South America, lived in the Amazon rainforest for months photographing wildlife. This parallel existence, glamorous model by contract, vagabond adventurer by choice, defined Lauren's 20s and 30s. She never saw them as contradictory. Modeling was how she funded the life she actually wanted to live. The fashion world was her day job, lucrative and occasionally interesting, but the real Lauren emerged when she left that world behind, when she was covered in jungle mud or sea salt, far from cameras and designers and anyone who cared about hemlines. Friends from this era remember Lauren as someone living two completely different lives, with equal commitment to both. On a shoot, she'd be perfectly professional, one photographer recalled. Then she'd finish, walk off set still in the couture gown, strip down to shorts and a tank top in the changing room, throw everything in a backpack and be gone. 3 days later, you'd hear she was in Peru or something, sleeping in a tent, no phone, completely unreachable. Then she'd show up for the next job like nothing had happened, completely present, completely professional. This ability to compartmentalize, to fully inhabit whatever space she was in without letting one identity bleed into the other, was remarkable. When Lauren was modeling, she was excellent at it, prepared, reliable, creative. When she was adventuring, she was equally committed, learning skills, taking risks, pushing her limits. She didn't phone it in on either end. She just refused to let either define her entirely. There was also a deliberate obscurity to her private life that was unusual for someone of her fame. While other supermodels of the era cultivated tabloid coverage, dated famous men, got photographed at Studio 54, Lauren largely avoided the celebrity scene. She went to required events, smiled for requisite photos, then disappeared. There were no scandals, no dramatic romances splashed across gossip columns, no carefully managed public persona beyond her work. Interviews with Lauren from this period reveal someone deeply uncomfortable with fame as concept. She understood modeling as job, could talk professionally about photography and fashion. But questions about her personal life, her feelings, her fears, she deflected with humor or brevity. "I'm not interesting," she'd say. "I just ride motorcycles and dive in oceans. Talk to someone else if you want drama." This refusal to perform celebrity, to give the public access to her interior life, was both principled and strategic. Lauren understood instinctively what many famous people learn too late, that privacy is a limited resource, that once you give it away, you can't reclaim it. She chose to keep herself for herself, to let her work speak and her private life remain exactly that, private. In her mid-30s, Lauren made another unexpected move. She decided to try acting. It was 1980 and Paul Schrader cast her in American Gigolo opposite Richard Gere. The film required Lauren to play a wealthy, sophisticated woman, not a huge stretch given her modeling background, but also to convey emotional depth, vulnerability, and complexity. Lauren approached acting the way she approached everything, with curiosity, commitment, and a refusal to be precious about the process. She took it seriously without taking herself seriously, a balance that's harder to achieve than it sounds. The reviews were mixed, but everyone agreed on one thing. Lauren Hutton had screen presence. The camera loved her in motion pictures the same way it loved her in stills. That gap, that smile, that ineffable quality of aliveness made her impossible to look away from. She did more films: The Gambler, Once Bitten, various projects throughout the 80s, but never fully committed to acting as a career. She was good enough to work consistently, but never invested enough to become great. Acting was another experience to add to the collection, another thing she'd tried and mastered well enough to know she didn't need to dedicate her life to it. What Lauren was really doing during these years, though she wouldn't have articulated it this way at the time, was refusing to be defined. Not by modeling, not by acting, not by any single identity or achievement. She was creating a life based on curiosity and courage rather than ambition and accumulation. She was showing that you could be successful without being driven, famous without being obsessed with fame, beautiful without making beauty your primary project. By the late 1980s, Lauren was in her mid-40s, ancient by modeling standards, especially for women. The industry that had embraced her 20 years earlier now had no use for her. Campaigns wanted fresh faces, young bodies, the next new thing. Lauren was history, a relic of an earlier era, someone people spoke about in past tense. Her phone stopped ringing. The offers dried up. The invitations to shows and parties slowed to a trickle. She was, for all intents and purposes, retired whether she chose to be or not. For some models, this transition is devastating. An identity crisis wrapped in an existential crisis, compounded by an industry that treats aging women as invisible failures. Lauren watched peers from her era struggle with this shift, saw some turn to plastic surgery in increasingly desperate attempts to maintain relevance, saw others sink into depression or addiction, unable to cope with becoming ordinary after years of being extraordinary. But Lauren, who had never fully invested her sense of self in modeling, who had always maintained parallel identities and interests, took the industry's rejection with equanimity that surprised everyone. including herself. She felt relief more than loss, relief that she could finally devote full time to the things she actually cared about, relief that she no longer had to schedule her adventures around shooting calendars, relief that she could age naturally without constant scrutiny. She bought land in a remote area, built a small house with her own hands, spent months at a time completely off-grid. She deepened her photography practice, transitioning from subject to artist, learning to see from the other side of the lens. She wrote, not for publication but for herself, processing decades of experiences, trying to make sense of a life that had been so public but felt so personal. These wilderness years, as she'd later call them, were transformative in ways she couldn't have predicted. Removed from the fashion world's constant feedback, the validation, the criticism, the attention, Lauren had to confront who she actually was beneath the image. It was disorienting at first, almost frightening. She'd spent so long being looked at that not being looked at felt like erasure. But gradually she came to understand that invisibility was freedom, that being ignored meant being unchained from others' expectations. She learned things about herself that decades of fame had obscured. She discovered she liked solitude more than she'd realized, that silence was more restorative than conversation, that she could go days without seeing another person and feel completely content. She also discovered vulnerabilities she'd hidden beneath confidence, fears about aging, about irrelevance, about what her life meant beyond the images she'd created. A journal entry from this period, which she'd later share in her memoir, captured the psychological reckoning. "I've been Lauren Hutton, the model, for so long I forgot I was also just Lauren. And now that I'm losing the first identity, I need to figure out if the second one is enough. Is there a self beneath the image? Or did I dissolve so thoroughly into the performance that there's nothing left when the curtain falls?" But then something unexpected happened. In the mid-1990s, brands started to realize that the women with purchasing power weren't 20. They were 40, 50, 60. And those women were tired of seeing only young models in advertisements for products they were buying. There was a market previously ignored for older models who could make aging look aspirational rather than tragic. Lauren, who had maintained her health and vitality through decades of physical activity, who had weathered into her mature beauty rather than fighting it desperately, was the perfect face for this new market. She began working again, not as often as in her prime, but regularly enough. And this time there was no pressure to hide her age, to pretend she was younger than she was. Her wrinkles were part of the appeal. She famously said, "A wrinkle is the record of a smile." It was such a Lauren quote, reframing age marks not as failures to maintain youth, but as evidence of a life fully experienced. Every line on her face was a story. Sun from sailing, creases from laughter, evidence of decades spent outdoors rather than hidden from light. Her wrinkles don't whisper age, they shout experience. In her 60s and 70s, Lauren became something rare. An elder stateswoman of fashion who was still working, still relevant, still booking covers and campaigns. Younger models sought her advice. Designers wanted her energy. She had achieved what almost no model ever does. Longevity based not on maintaining youth, but on evolving with authenticity. She wore her years like evidence, not apology. The secret, if there was one, was that Lauren had never derived her entire identity from being beautiful. Beauty was a tool, occasionally useful, but not the sum total of who she was. So when beauty shifted, as it inevitably does with age, she wasn't left with nothing. She still had her curiosity, her courage, her gap-toothed smile, her motorcycle, her adventures. She was still herself, just older. And that self was interesting in ways that transcended physical appearance. At 70, she walked for Bottega Veneta during Milan Fashion Week. The crowd went wild, not with nostalgia but with genuine enthusiasm. Here was a woman who looked 70, who moved like 70, who made no apologies for being 70, and who somehow made 70 look not just acceptable but desirable. She wasn't trying to pass for younger. She was claiming age as its own form of power. Lauren didn't age out of fashion. Fashion finally aged into her. Backstage, younger models asked how she did it, how she maintained her confidence, her relevance, her career across 6 decades. Lauren's answer was characteristically blunt. I never closed the gap, never hid the wrinkles, never pretended to be anything other than what I am. You can't compete with your younger self, so don't try. Be who you are right now with enthusiasm. It sounds simple, but it's revolutionary in an industry built on the opposite premise, that women should constantly strive to look younger, hide age, maintain youth's appearance at all costs. Lauren's refusal to play that game hadn't just saved her mental health, it had extended her career. Now at 80, standing before cameras for Vogue Italia, Lauren Hutton embodies something fashion is still learning to understand. That authenticity is its own category of beautiful, that the things we're told to fix are often the things that make us memorable, that aging is not failure but evolution. The gap remains. Wider now, deeper, a canyon carved by time and laughter. Photographers have offered gently to retouch it away in post-production. Lauren refuses every time. That gap has been her signature, her rebellion, her reminder that perfection is boring and authenticity is priceless. To close it now, even digitally, would be to betray every woman who saw that gap and thought, maybe my imperfection is okay too. Lauren Hutton is still here, still working, still riding her motorcycle through desert highways, still diving in tropical waters, still living with the kind of fearless joy that most people abandon by 30. She never became who fashion wanted her to be. She became herself, loudly and unapologetically, and somehow that was enough. More than enough. It was revolutionary. The girl who was rejected 30 times for having a gap in her teeth became the woman who proved that our so-called flaws are often our most compelling features. The model who was told she'd never work became the face that launched 1 million letters from women who finally saw themselves represented in fashion. The adventurer who treated modeling as a means rather than an end became proof that you can be successful without letting success define you. Lauren Hutton didn't just survive fashion. She outlasted it, outlived its rigid standards, outsmiled its gatekeepers. And every time someone tells a young woman to fix herself, to change something essential to become acceptable, Lauren's gap-toothed smile stands as refutation. Imperfection isn't beauty's disguise, it's beauty's truth. At 80, Lauren still rides her motorcycle across state lines, still books campaigns, still refuses to apologize for taking up space. Her face maps a life of adventure and laughter and sun and decades of not giving a damn what anyone thought. She wanted to look possible, not perfect. She wanted to be alive, not admired from a distance. And she got exactly what she wanted, a life lived on her terms in full color without apologies. 80 years, one gap, and the same grin that rewrote every rule. The world learned to smile wider because Lauren Hutton never closed hers. When the world keeps selling perfection, is staying real the last luxury? And if the light comes through the gaps, why are we still trying to seal them?